is rehearsing and the bagpipes are a-bursting, for Macpherson is rehearsing to swing. And from Edinburgh to Dundee, every lad and every lassie knows Macpherson is rehearsing to swing. Ach, I did not care, said Sandy, if the elders now approve. I, the chick-wave clan's a dandy, and I'm in a mellow groove. Now the bonny lassies with the kilties on their chassis have forgotten all about the Highland fling. Young and old folks get together and there's trucking in the heather when Macpherson is rehearsing to swing.
Hello and welcome to this episode number 13 of the For All That podcast, in a week which has been quite unlucky for all consumers of Findus cheap meat slurry products. Plenty going on this week, and as usual we've got Michael Greenwell. He's here with us. How are you doing, Michael?
Alright, I'm just back from my annual or biannual inspection of the rail networks of Central Europe, and I can tell you that they're still there.
Is that your only finding?
Pretty much. They're as much the same as they were, and that Britons are still ridiculously expensive compared.
I know, I need to have anything audited in future. I'm sure I'll rely on your excellent services. We're also joined today by Duncan Hothersall, who's a Labour activist from Edinburgh. Thank you for coming on, Duncan. How are you getting on?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Excellent.
Thanks for inviting me.
And it's been quite an interesting week in a range of respects. I mean, we went back to the sort of Victorian era of finding bits of horses and our mushroom catch-up and things. But perhaps the biggest story of this week has been the equal marriage vote in Westminster, which attracted quite a lot of attention and comment, and I know that Twitter was all aflame with opinion and exchanges of that when the MPs were discussing on and on about their various views on the matter. I mean, Duncan, one of the things which struck lots of people was the extent to which kind of Scottish Labour men, I suppose, a significant number of them, I think 6, 7 of them, voted against the whole proposition for England and Wales. I wonder, does it just exemplify the extent to which all of our parties are really going to be split on this?
I think it's very sad, first of all, that people have chosen to sort of ignore what is essentially Labour policy. Or, you know, even if our policy is not committed to marriage equality, we are committed to equality of rights for LGBT people. I think the big thing hanging over it is religion. The people who voted against, there were 6, I think, who voted against. There were 3 abstentions, but it's not clear where those people lie at all. But the 6 are basically all relying either on their personal religious convictions or their postbacks for making for voting the way they did. And I just think both of these things are such a cop-out. You know, MPs are not there to do a plebiscite of their constituents every time something that they don't want to deal with comes up. They're there as our representatives to make decisions on the basis of the informed opinion. So it's disappointing. I think it is indicative of the way, you know, this sort of issue tends to be fudged. It should have been a whipped vote, as far as I'm concerned, for every party. But we call it an issue of conscience. I mean, if we're going to start defining things as issues of conscience, surely scrapping levels of welfare is an issue of conscience. And these things are whipped. So,
yeah, I think that's something I've always found very fascinating, this sort of construction of certain issues of conscience. And I can see why, as a matter of venal calculation, of avoiding embarrassment, if you have someone in your party, say, I don't know, like Fergus Ewing, like Rosanna Cunningham, and they are ministers in your government, then I can see why it's only sensible as a way of sort of negotiating the difficulty to have conscience votes. But I entirely agree, actually. How does that construct all the other kind of votes? Are they, you know, they're votes without conscience? I always find that quite...
Exactly.
It's a rather sort of suspect way of framing the whole thing, I always think.
No, it's just doublethink, isn't it? We call it conscience, but it's not. It's nothing to do with conscience. It's votes of excuse.
Yeah, it's funny, Michael. I don't know what you think about that. I mean, you've always got a keen eye for the sort of the construction of arguments and that sort of manipulation that goes on at that kind of basic level. And obviously, I think it's quite useful for the Conservatives, for the Labour Party, for the SNP as well, frankly, to try and deal with the internal conflicts by making this an issue of conscience in inverted commas. I wonder, are you as suspicious about that as Duncan and I are?
Certainly. I think Dung said votes of excuse or votes of Prime Minister or First Minister doesn't want to touch it with a shitty stick. Or even a sticky shit, if you prefer. But no, but like it's that there is that politics of excuse. But one thing Duncan said I found interesting, that MPs are there to do an informed vote, not to conduct a quick plebiscite. I'd actually be more in favour of a system where they had to do a quick plebiscite. I think that's called more democracy. But because one of the times I was on a junket in Parliament, we had to meet an MP, and I'm not going to name names, but this came up. This kind of discussion about someone mentioned something, and it's along the lines of what you're talking about here, but someone mentioned this idea that for a certain section in every vote in the Parliament, maybe some members of the public should be taken at random, like another 600 of the public, like a jury, kind of randomised computer, and they should be allowed to vote on the issue as well. And I'm not necessarily in favour of that. I think it's a very interesting idea. I'm not sure how you would administer it. But the reasons that the MP gave were so patronising and so out of order that I ended up arguing for the other guy just to keep it going. Because he said, well, a lot of the legislation and the arguments that come in here are very complex, and ordinary members of the public can't be expected to understand and worry their pretty little heads about it. And I was like, excuse me, jury duty, hello, anyone, and it was actually a Labour MP, sorry to mention that, Duncan. Currently
imagine my surprise.
A currently serving Labour MP as well. But
dear.
It's an interesting idea, like what constructs a vote of conscience and what isn't. Probably they all should be, and get rid of the whip entirely. But then what happens is the electoral things have to change, because you can make the case that people are voting for a manifesto, not for a person. So they're all the factors go into each other. It's a complicated issue.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, though, this idea about representative government, I suppose, or representative sent by particular constituencies to reflect their views. And one of the things which is quite interesting about, I think, this whole debate on same-sex marriage is the extent to which opposition to it is regarded as particularly problematic. And I actually think, for what it's worth, that there are parts of England where MPs are representing democratically their constituents' views by voting against. And there's a part of me which thinks that actually that is what democracy is for. And I don't necessarily want to see a whole parliament united behind a proposition which is actually, in the country, quite divisive. I don't know what you think about that.
Various things, but
it's a
the main one is that we need to understand that this is an issue about equality. It's essentially a human rights issue. Now, obviously, some people will argue against that, but that's where I'm coming from. I believe it's a human rights issue, and at that point, you have to set aside this notion of putting it to a vote of the general public, because you don't protect human rights by going for the majority view, because then the majority trumps the minority. We wouldn't have scrapped the death sentence, for example, if we'd had a countrywide plebiscite. So I think it is important to differentiate between types of votes. There are issues which I think, we could work on the basis of obviously changing the constitution and then having some sort of greater referendum approach. But on issues of human rights, I simply think that's a mismatch. You don't ask people if we should discriminate against minority groups, because the whole point of legislation to remove that discrimination is it is to control the majority.
So, is there a question about that on the equality front? I know it was a question raised by a few MPs in the debate, and actually they're quite right. This is not a measure which will equalise things in the sense of treating people in the same way. That there are loads of features of marriage which don't obtain to civil partnerships, and therefore there's an inequality there. But there's also several features of marriages, heterosexual marriages, same-sex marriages, which are going to be quite different. I mean, one of the examples I talked about in the last podcast, ludicrously, is this English law conception of consummation, amongst other things. And I wonder, one of the perhaps clearest examples of the potential for inequality is civil partnerships for everybody, regardless of what their sex is. And I'm a big supporter of that. I would much rather get a civil partnership than get married, I must say. So I wonder if we have to kind of push and amend the legislation a wee bit too in terms of this English bill in order to make it to deliver that kind of equality you were talking about there, Duncan?
I think there's definitely amendments that could be usefully made, and certainly I'm with you in terms of making civil partnerships accessible to more people, not least because there's a genuine pull for that. I was speaking to an elderly lady recently who was quite adamant about wanting to have a civil partnership with her male partner because she didn't want to replace her husband who had died. She wanted a civil partnership because it wasn't marriage. And I mean, there are a million reasons why you might want to choose a civil partnership as opposed to a marriage. The key thing would be that we should give people the choice. Of course, the whole reason why that isn't in the bill is, at this point, you can argue that making marriage available to everybody doesn't undermine it. But if you make civil partnership available to everybody, you damn right are undermining marriage.
Yeah, I heard that argument. I think that's a curious one, that was the reason why the government in Westminster didn't bring forward a kind of equalising measure in civil partnership, just because they didn't want to, in inverted commas, undermine marriage. Maybe that moves us on to... sorry, Michael, do you want to come in?
Yeah, but I mean, maybe I think in this issue, more than most, you can see the influence of kind of government by Daily Mail outrage. Politicians who might not necessarily, as we've seen in the vote, might not necessarily have any objections to this, or less than you might find in the general public, are terrified of at least classifying things in the same way because they know that the reaction that's going to come.
What do you mean by that? Sorry, I mean...
The way over-the-top reaction that's going to come from the Daily Mail about, this is disgraceful, the standard kind of Christian right argument that's likely to come from the Daily Mail. And they live in fear of that, politicians. Yeah. So they try to classify things in a different way so that it's almost the same as marriage. It's marriage, but with a different name. It's there's always this kind of wordplay so that it's not given exactly the same legal status.
Maybe there's a nice, just to bring it in from Westminster, move north of the border and look at the politics of this in Holyrood, which I think has been quite interesting because there have been, it seems to me, two parallel debates going on in the UK political sphere about English and Welsh introduction of this, and then the kind of Scottish sphere, which has been very much, I think, dominated by the Catholic Church in terms of opposition. And one argument you could make is that actually the Scottish government have missed a bit of a trick here by taking such a long period of time to come to a view on this, that really the whole issue is being led in terms of the public consciousness from down south, and therefore an opportunity, you might well think, for the Scottish government to indicate its distinctiveness first was forgone and has been taken over by Westminster. I don't know, Duncan, if that resonates with you, if that's a worry or a feature.
To be perfectly honest, I'm mystified by the Scottish government's dragging of its heels on it. I understand that they're very aware that it needs to be as consulted on and more consulted on than any bill in history, and they're desperate to put it across as a consensus approach, and I think that's right. But to be brutally political about it, if I were the SNP in government, I would want to have this absolutely done and dusted by the end of 2013, because, there's another thing they want to do the year after. And Gordon Wilson's not going to go away. The voices of that type are not going to go away. I had always assumed, and certainly from conversations with SNP folk, I think most of them had assumed that was the idea, to get, hit this early. It's a statement of direction. It's a positive thing for the majority of Scots, so that's good. But you don't want it trammeling up the bigger argument that they want to have next year. And to my mind, looking at the possibilities, I can't see them getting it in before the end of this year. But given the committee stages, there's no way they're going to be shortcuts on this one. So it's odd. It mystifies me as to why they've dragged their heels. There was no real need for the second consultation on the wording of the bill. To my mind, they've missed a trick.
Well, I don't know, Michael. I don't know how closely you followed this sort of Scottish angle on this, but there's another feature of this which has occurred to me is the position of Ruth Davidson, and she herself is in favour of it. But if you look at the list of MSPs and how they've indicated they're going to support, she cuts quite an isolated figure, actually, in terms of her own Scottish party. It's just her and Jackson Carlaw, her deputy, who are presently likely to support this bill. And Ironically, I suppose you might think, considering